I was halfway through wiping down the kitchen counter when his phone rang. It wasn't unusual for Jack's phone to go off this time of morning. He's always been the kind who answers calls before the second ring, always in motion, always in the middle of something important. But that day, he didn't take it in the kitchen. He stepped into the hallway still in his work shirt, one sleeve rolled tie hanging loose. The sound of his voice drifted back low and clipped. I kept wiping the same small patch of counter not because it needed it, but because my hand had frozen in that motion. The smell of the coffee I'd poured minutes earlier filled the air warm, rich, though something in it already seemed bitter. I could hear him pacing the floorboards, creaking in those spots I know by heart. Then there was a pause. A real one. The kind where you can feel someone's mind turning. And in that pause, another voice came through. It wasn't loud, but I didn't need it to be. Female. Warm. Low, with that kind of easy confidence you only use with someone you've known in a certain way. There was a softness to her tone, not forced, not polite. Familiar. And just like that, my breath caught somewhere between my chest and my throat. She said I missed last night. Nothing more, nothing less. No context, no elaborate lit-in. Just the statement bare and hanging there. I felt my fingers tighten around the dishcloth, my knuckles pressing white. Jack's answer was a quiet mumble too low for me to catch, and then a chuckle. Not his work chuckle. Not the kind you give to a colleague to smooth a moment over. This was softer, private. The phone was still on speaker and he hadn't realized. I didn't hang up. I didn't even move. My eyes went to the kitchen table where my coffee sat untouched. The surface had that faint ripple like it was holding its own breath. I've heard people describe moments like these as earth-shattering, but for me, it wasn't an explosion. It was something subtler, like hearing a sound in the walls of your house, a crack you didn't know was there shifting under its own weight. I stayed there anchored to the counter, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the faint warmth in her voice. I tried to picture her. Was she blonde? Did she know about me? Did she even care? He didn't say her name. She didn't say his. And yet the intimacy in their exchange felt older than names. When the line went quiet again, I thought maybe they'd hung up. But then came that small click, the kind you only hear if you're paying attention, and the sound of his footsteps heading back toward the kitchen. I had time to fold the dishcloth over the faucet handle and straighten my spine. He walked in, set his phone on the counter face down, and poured himself more coffee. His hand brushed the pot without hesitation, his movements easy the way you'd move if you'd been here all along. "Did you take the trash out?" he asked. The words landed in the air like a stone dropped into still water. I nodded, kept my voice neutral. "Yeah." He didn't look at me long, just enough to register the answer before taking a sip, and that was it. No flicker of guilt in his eyes, no misplaced tension in his voice. If he knew I'd heard anything, he didn't let it show. For the next hour, I moved through the kitchen like a shadow. I rinsed plates, rearranged the fruit bowl, checked the mail. My coffee stayed untouched, cooling, inch by inch, the smell shifting from warm to stale. I didn't taste it once. When he left for work, his tie neatly knotted. Now he kissed my temple out of habit. It was a gesture I'd once leaned into. This time, I stayed perfectly still. The door shut behind him, and I stood in the silence that followed. Not the comforting kind, this was the silence of something unspoken pressing against the walls. I walked over to the table, sat down in the chair he'd vacated earlier, and stared at his coffee mug. There was a faint ring where it had rested on the wood, a dark circle drying slowly. I thought about calling Lydia my sister right then. But the truth was, I wasn't ready to hear her voice in this. Not yet. Lydia has a way of seeing straight through me, and if I let her hear me in this state, she'd pull the truth out faster than I was ready for. So instead, I did something I hadn't done in years. I just sat there. No music, no television, no distractions. The refrigerator hummed. Somewhere outside a delivery truck idled and then drove away. My coffee cup still sat on the counter where I'd left it, a thin skin forming on top. The oddest part was that I didn't feel shocked. Not exactly. If anything, the ground had been softening under my feet for a while now. I'd felt the distance in small, quiet ways. His late nights explained too neatly the smell of cologne. He didn't own the way his phone started living face down. Hearing that voice, her voice wasn't a revelation. It was confirmation. By the time the clock read noon, I still hadn't moved much. I poured the coffee down the sink, the sound of it swirling away louder than it should have been. The rest of the day went on as usual. I answered emails, folded laundry, even laughed once at something on the radio, but underneath it there was this low hum, like a current I couldn't turn off. When Jack came home that evening, I was in the kitchen again. He walked in, kissed me in that same casual way, and asked about dinner. I told him I'd ordered takeout. He didn't question it. And maybe that's what stayed with me most, the way he didn't notice anything different. That night, lying in bed beside him, I stared at the faint light under the doorway from the hall. It made a thin, perfect line across the carpet. A boundary. One that could be crossed without much effort, but once crossed, there'd be no pretending it hadn't been. I listened to his breathing shift as he fell asleep, steady and untroubled. My own breath stayed shallow. Somewhere between midnight and dawn, I decided I wouldn't tell him I'd heard. Not yet. I'd hold it, turn it over in my mind, learn its shape, before deciding what to do with it. And so I kept it. The voice. The words. The soft chuckle meant for someone else. All of it locked quietly inside me like the faintest crack in a wall you can't yet see but know is there. Was I supposed to pretend I hadn't heard it? That's what I asked myself the next morning, standing in the doorway between the kitchen and the hallway, one foot on tile, one on hardwood, as if even my body couldn't commit. The house was the same as always, spoon in the sink. His jacket tossed over a chair, a thin ring of coffee drying where his mug had been, and yet everything had a faint outline around it, like I was seeing it through a layer of glass. The voice from the call kept threading itself into mundane sounds. The whisk of my sleeve against the counter became her breath, the fridge's soft hum her low laugh. I didn't hear words so much as intention, familiarity, ease. I'd always been good at recognizing voices. As a kid, I could call people by name before they entered the room just by the way their heels sounded on the porch steps, the rhythm of their keys. The voice on Jack's call wasn't anyone I knew, and that should have made it easier. Somehow, it made it worse. She didn't belong to any of the categories I'd clipped and filed: work, friend, neighbor, old acquaintance, so she was free to be anything I feared. I poured coffee, watched a thin steam spiral upward, and didn't touch it. I just let it stand there, turning from warmth to room temperature, as though that slow cooling could tell me something about how quickly trust loses heat. The cup had a hairline crack near the handle. I'd noticed it weeks ago and ignored it because the cup still held what it needed to hold. Now I couldn't unsee it. Jack's phone lay face down on the table. The screen would bloom to life with alerts, then go dark again, a pulse. Twice I reached for it without meaning to, and twice I pulled my hand back. It wasn't fear of what I'd find that stopped me. It was the feeling that opening something changes it, the way breaking a shell to check if it's empty makes the emptiness permanent. I didn't ask him about it when he came into the kitchen in his socks, hair damp from the shower rubbing the back of his neck like the day had arrived too soon. He asked if I'd seen his blue folder. I said no. We did the choreography we'd perfected over years, stepping past each other without colliding, handing off a dish towel and Apple a look. "I'll be late tonight," he said, not looking at me already, glancing toward the hall. "Quarterly reports?" I nodded. "Okay." He took a sip of his coffee, winced at the temperature, put it down, and reached for his keys. He didn't finish the cup. The scent hung in the air as the door clicked shut behind him, that small click that's harder than a slam because it leaves no place to put your startle. I carried his mug to the sink and lined it up with mine ring beside ring, as if they belonged to the same set of ruins. For a long moment I stood there with my hands braced on the counter and replayed the sentence I'd heard I missed last night, trying to hear what came before it. I'd been wiping the counter. He'd walked into the hall, the creak of the loose board by the thermostat, a bird outside the window, and then her. If I rewound far enough, would I find a hinge I could pry up something that explained everything, or had I already heard enough? At 10, I found myself at the grocery store without remembering getting in the car. I stood in front of the dairy case staring at rows of milk, the fluorescent lights making everything a little too bright. A woman beside me reached for the same carton and our hands touched. She smiled. I smiled back, my mouth remembering how to be polite while the rest of me had not yet returned. In the cereal aisle, my phone buzzed. I didn't look. I let it buzz again, then stop, then buzz once more like a fly that hasn't realized the window is closed. When I finally slid it out, the notification was from Jack. "Do we need anything for dinner?" A second message followed before I could respond. VM. I typed no, then erased it. I put the phone back in my bag, screen down, and watched my reflection waver in a row of foil-lined boxes, thin and pale beneath the store's light. On the drive home, I noticed the doorways. Not the literal ones, though, those too, but the thresholds that weren't visible until you recognized them, the moment when affection becomes habit, when habit sours into obligation, when the obligations we've agreed to start to feel like costumes that itch. I had crossed a boundary yesterday without moving anywhere. Now the house looked different from the street, as if it were holding its breath. When I carried the bags inside, I saw a thin slip of paper on the hall table. A receipt. No store name, just a total and a time. I knew his habit of emptying his pockets there before he left again, and I knew this paper wasn't yesterday's. The edge was crisp, the ink a little smudged, like someone's thumb had hesitated across it. I put it under the bowl where we kept keys and pretended I hadn't seen it. Pretending I was learning was a muscle. It fatigued. By afternoon, the house had settled into its usual midday quiet. I answered emails, then stopped answering them. The plant by the window needed water, but I didn't give it any because I wanted to see what neglect looked like before it became damage. There was a candle on the bathroom shelf we hardly used. I knew its scent without lighting it, amber and something like cedar. I thought of striking a match just to fill the house with a different air, but I didn't. I didn't want to layer beauty over a smell I should learn to recognize. Around 4, Lydia texted. "You good?" 2 words, and I could hear her voice saying them, not casual, not dramatic. If I called her, I'd hear the small scrape of her kitchen chair against tile, the clink of her cheap bracelets, the way she goes quiet when she's listening. I stared at the screen long enough for the message to fade down the list, then turned the phone over again. I would tell her, but not now, not while the shape of this thing was still fogged. I needed it to resolve itself in my eyes first. I needed to know where I was standing before I invited anyone to stand with me. Late afternoon light made a long bar across the hallway. I stood in it like someone considering a crossing. The doorway to Jack's office was closed as always. He'd never had to say it was off limits. The door spoke for him. I touched the knob not to turn it, just to feel the cool metal, and pulled my hand back. There's a kind of power in not opening a door you could. It makes the air on both sides admit itself. I set the table for one without thinking. Then I took the extra plate from the counter and put it beside the first, as if ritual could smooth over reality. I made pasta that was more about the chopping than the eating, and when I sat down I placed my phone face up next to my fork. Blank screen. No pulse. For a second I felt a small ridiculous relief that it hadn't lit up with his name, and then I felt ashamed of the relief, which was another thing to carry. When he finally called to say he'd be later than late, I found myself listening not to his words, but to the room around him. A clatter that didn't sound like an office, a brightness in his voice that didn't fit the heaviness of reports. Voices in the background, a woman's laugh. Not the same laugh I'd heard that morning, lighter, higher, but still a laugh. Drive safe, I said, and heard how even I sounded. Not bitter, not sweet. Just even, like a line drawn with a ruler. After I hung up, I turned off the kitchen lights and stood at the window. The glass held a dim version of me, hair pulled back, eyes that looked like they'd learned something and weren't sure if they wanted it. Outside, a car door shut somewhere. A dog barked half-heartedly. A porch light blinked on. The neighborhood was doing what neighborhoods do, carrying on unremarkable. The ordinary felt a little cruel in its confidence. I carried my untouched coffee to the sink and poured it out slow. I watched the way it spiraled toward the drain, how the last thin ribbon clung to the porcelain before letting go. The cup made a soft knock when I set it upside down to dry. In the small quiet that followed, I could hear the blood in my ears. In bed, the ceiling didn't change. It still had that faint hairline crack above the dresser that we joked about fixing every spring. Jack came home after I'd turned off my lamp. He moved carefully, like someone trying not to wake a sleeping child. The bed dipped under his weight. He stayed on his side, breathing steady, and I stayed on mine, counting. 30 breaths, 50, 100. At some point between one number and the next, I slipped under, and in whatever place I went to, a woman with a warm, low voice said she missed last night, and the room I was in filled with a scent I recognized and couldn't name. I woke before dawn to the gray-blue that makes everything honest. I went into the kitchen and stood in the doorway and tried to decide if I was a person who needed truth loud or truth quiet. The doorways in this house had watched me for years, through mornings that felt like the world was held up by nothing but coffee and goodwill, through nights when the only music was dishes drying, and now they watched me again, witnessing the moment when I chose not to step through, not yet. Waiting is a decision, too. On the table, Jack's phone lay where he'd left it, face down. I stood there long enough to hear the heat kick on, long enough for my bare feet to go numb on the tile, and then I picked up his phone and turned it over. The screen stayed dark. I set it down. I said my name out loud so quietly I barely heard it. Elena. I wanted to make sure I still sounded like myself. The word landed and didn't echo. That felt like something I could live with. The kettle began to whisper on the stove. I let it. I didn't light the candle. I didn't open the office door. I didn't call my sister. I did not drink the coffee I poured. Instead, I watched the doorway and felt the cool air from the hall reach my ankles and thought, not today. Not yet. But soon. The days after the call had a texture I could feel in my teeth. Everything carried a faint grit, like the air in the house had been sifted through ash. Jack moved through rooms as though nothing had shifted, and I found myself shadowing him without meaning to, watching his hands when he typed the way his eyes darted to his phone like he was checking the weather on another planet. I didn't confront him. Instead, I memorized. His new cologne, faint sandalwood, layered over something sharper. The moments when he left his phone on the counter for too long, and then returned for it with a hand just a fraction too quick. The way he checked the door lock twice when he left, as though sealing something inside. At night, his breathing stayed steady, a metronome I'd known for years. But when I reached for the comfort of its rhythm, I found no comfort there, only the fact of it. The distance between us was less a gap and more a kind of weather constant, invisible, shaping everything. The kitchen had become my map. The fruit bowl he never noticed, the mail pile we used to sort together, the narrow drawer that stuck halfway when you pulled it, these things were mine in a way they hadn't been before. And in the mornings, I let my coffee go cold on purpose, watching the steam thin to nothing, as though timing it might give me some control over what I could not name. On Tuesday, I left my phone on silent. Not because I didn't want to hear it, but because I couldn't risk what it might bring. Any ring, any buzz might be her again, her voice slipping into my day like water under a door. I pictured her in every corner I couldn't see, in the space between his words, in the pauses he carried around like spare change. I thought of asking him about his day just to see how much he'd invent, but I didn't. I let him talk about his boss's bad tie, the traffic, the weather. He didn't ask me about mine, and I didn't offer. Our silences had begun to match in size, if not in meaning. One night while we were on the couch, he scrolled through his phone, thumb flicking upward with practiced ease. I watched the reflection of the screen in his glasses. The small glow caught on his cheekbone made him look younger, as though the light itself remembered a time when we were different. I wondered if she'd seen him like that, half lit, half hidden, and if she'd thought what I once thought, that he was most beautiful when he wasn't aware of being seen. He laughed once at something he read and tilted the phone away from me. The movement was so casual it could have been innocent, but it landed in my chest like a hand pressed against a wound. Later, when he went to bed, I stayed in the darkened living room. The silence of the house at night was deeper now, thick enough to lean against. I traced the outline of the doorway in my mind, the one between the kitchen and the hall where I'd first heard her voice, and I felt a strange gratitude for it. It had become a marker, a point I could return to when I needed to remember the exact moment something changed. In the morning, I made breakfast for both of us, but ate alone. He'd left early, a note on the counter. Meeting ran long. Back late. The handwriting was quick, almost sloppy, like he was in a hurry to be somewhere he didn't want me to picture. I stood there with my plate in hand, looking at the note until the edges curled slightly from the heat of the toaster. I put it in the drawer where we kept spare batteries and manuals for appliances we no longer owned. I wasn't ready to throw it away, but I didn't want it in sight either. The rest of the day passed in a kind of slow, deliberate quiet. I didn't open the curtains until late afternoon, when the sun had turned the living room into a strip of light and shadow. Standing there, I realized I'd begun measuring time not by hours, but by the weight of the air, by the moment when the light crossed from the wall to the floor. And when night came again, I listened to the sound of his breathing steady as before, and thought, this is how people live beside each other, and not with each other. This is how it happens. I didn't cry. I didn't move. I just lay there waiting for the quiet to tell me what to do next. It was Lydia who finally cracked the silence, though she didn't know it when she did. We'd arranged to meet at her place for coffee, the kind of casual plans sisters make when the weather's between seasons and the days feel like they need a reason. I drove there with the radio low, the same 2-lane road I'd been taking since high school, past the diner with the peeling mural and the gas station that still used numbers you had to flip by hand. The familiarity should have been comforting, but it made me feel like I was circling the same point on a map I couldn't escape. Lydia's kitchen smelled faintly of cinnamon, though I didn't see anything baking. She was at the counter, hair pulled back, her mug in both hands, like she was cradling something alive. "You look tired," she said. No smile, no teasing, just the words plain and level. I wanted to tell her I'd slept fine, that I'd been busy, that the weather had been strange. Instead, I said, "I think Jack's seeing someone." The sentence left my mouth without my permission, like it had been waiting at the edge of my teeth for days. Lydia didn't gasp. She didn't say she was sorry. She just set her mug down and looked at me in that way she has slow, deliberate eyes, steady like she's reading the fine print in a contract. "You already knew," she said. I opened my mouth to argue, but nothing came. She was right. Of course she was right. I'd known before the call, before the voice. I'd known in the way you know rain's coming, even when the sky's still clear. "What happened?" she asked. I told her about the phone left on speaker, about the woman's voice, warm, low, the kind that makes a room feel smaller. I didn't tell her exactly what the woman had said. Saying those words out loud would have made them too real, too solid in the air between us. Lydia's fingers tapped the side of her mug. "So what are you going to do?" The question felt heavier than the moment could hold. I stared at the steam rising from my coffee and realized I didn't know, or maybe I did and I just didn't want to name it yet. "You don't have to decide today," Lydia said, like she could see the thought on my face. "But you can't stay nowhere forever." Her kitchen clock ticked louder after that every second, a reminder that the world kept moving, whether I did or not. When I left, the late afternoon light had that golden edge that makes everything look softer than it is. I drove back to my house and parked in the driveway, but I didn't get out right away. I sat there with the engine off, staring at the front door. The doorway seemed heavier than it had that morning, like the air around it had thickened. Inside the house was quiet. Too quiet. I stood in the entryway holding my bag, not sure whether I was coming home or just arriving at a place that happened to have my things in it. Jack's shoes were by the door, one tipped slightly on its side. A small detail, but it felt like a signature. I touched the knob of the closed office door as I passed. Still locked. Still keeping its secrets. That night, I told Jack I'd seen Lydia. He asked how she was, and I said she was fine. I didn't mention our conversation. I didn't mention the way her eyes had pinned me in place, or the fact that she'd named my knowing before I could. Instead, I asked him how his day had been. He said it was long. He didn't look at me when he said it. I didn't press. When he went to bed, I stayed in the living room until the only light was the faint line spilling under the bedroom door. The quiet had a shape now, one I could almost trace. And when I finally lay down beside him, I thought of Lydia's eyes steady, unblinking, waiting for me to see what she already did. It happened without planning, which is how most things I regret begin. I was folding laundry in our bedroom, shirts in one pile, socks in another, a pair of jeans that still carried the faint scent of the detergent I've been using for years. The sun through the blinds made thin stripes across the bed, catching on the edge of Jack's nightstand. I'd passed that nightstand 1,000 times without touching it. I'd dusted around it, vacuumed beside it, never opened it. Not once. But that day my hand moved before I could talk myself out of it. The drawer slid open with the smallest resistance, like it knew it wasn't supposed to. Inside, it was tidy in a way that wasn't natural for him. A black pen I'd never seen before, heavy, sleek, not the kind you buy in a pack of 10. A folded receipt with no store name, just a total and a faint smudge where a thumb had pressed. And under the pen, a hotel key card, white unmarked except for a magnetic strip. I touched the pen first, rolling it between my fingers. It felt deliberate, chosen. Jack uses whatever pen's lying around. This one had been kept. I set it back exactly where I found it, aligning it with the edge of the drawer. The receipt came next. The numbers meant nothing to me, but at the bottom, in hurried handwriting, was a name. Not mine. Not his. A third name, one I didn't recognize. I didn't linger on it. My heartbeat had quickened in that way that makes sound travel oddly in your head, each noise inside you louder than the room itself. The key card was cold against my palm. It looked clean, untouched, but I knew that wasn't the truth. It didn't have to be used recently to mean what it meant. I placed each item back in its place, matching the angles as if returning stolen evidence. My fingers trembled not from fear exactly, but from something sharper, something closer to resolve. When I closed the drawer, the click of it settling back into place felt final, like a sentence ending. I stood there for a moment holding a folded towel, staring at the smooth wood as if it could tell me the story I didn't have. I'd never thought of our bedroom as a place with secrets. That was for other rooms: the locked office, the glove compartment, the pockets of jackets hung in the coat closet. But standing there, I realized every drawer I'd never opened could be holding something I didn't want to know. The laundry sat half-folded on the bed when Jack came in that evening. He loosened his tie, asked about dinner, and didn't notice the way my eyes kept drifting to the nightstand. Over the next few days, I found myself cataloging more than just the contents of that drawer. I noticed how often he took his phone into the bathroom, how quickly he closed his laptop when I walked past. I wasn't looking for proof anymore. I already had enough to fill the space between us. I was just learning the pattern of it. That night when he was in the shower, I stood in the doorway of the bedroom and looked at the drawer again. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. The knowledge of what was inside was its own weight, one I was beginning to carry without letting it slow me down. The rest of the laundry went into drawers I had no reason to suspect. Still, I noticed how many in this house I'd never opened, and I wondered when that had stopped being about trust and started being about not wanting to see. I lay in bed later, the drawer within arm's reach, Jack asleep beside me. I could feel the cool line of air from the window on my face. Somewhere in the dark, I thought there's a difference between finding something and being ready to know what it means. And I wasn't ready. Not yet. It's strange how quickly you can adapt to something you once thought would destroy you. Within weeks, I could hear the difference between Jack telling the truth and Jack telling a version of it. The change was subtle, more in the pauses than in the words themselves. A beat too long before answering, like he was sorting through options. A softness at the end of a sentence, as if he hoped it would land without making a sound. I started small, asking questions I already knew the answers to. Did you get milk on your way home when I'd seen the carton in the fridge that morning? Were you here at 5 when his car hadn't been in the driveway until after 6? The lies weren't elaborate. They were quick, almost casual, like skipping a step in a staircase you've walked 100 times. But my ears caught them and my stomach kept the count. It wasn't about catching him, it was about knowing the terrain. Lies are a language, and once you start learning it, you can't unhear it. His phone became a constant presence, a third party in the room. Even when it was face down, it hummed with the possibility of interruption. Sometimes in the middle of a conversation, he'd glance at it like checking for an escape route. I began to measure his attention in seconds, not minutes. The house itself seemed to change its acoustics. The bathroom fan muffled the sound of his calls just enough that I had to lean closer to the door. The creak in the hallway floorboards became an early warning system for when he was moving toward or away from me. I noticed the way his voice lowered when he spoke in the kitchen late at night, the way he lingered by the sink as though the faucet's rush could swallow his words. One evening I watched him from across the living room as he typed on his laptop. His face was still focused, but his hands betrayed him slowing when he replied to a message, pausing before hitting send. I wondered if she was on the other end of those pauses, filling them with her warmth, her voice, her words meant only for him. I didn't tell Lydia about the drawer or the key card. Not yet. I wasn't ready for her to ask the questions I'd been avoiding myself. Instead, I let her believe I was still in the stage of suspicion, not confirmation. It felt safer there, even if it was a lie of my own. My silence became a shield. I learned to nod at the right moments, to murmur "meme" or "yeah" without committing to anything. I became fluent in non-answers, mirroring the way he spoke to me. At night in the dark, I listened for signs of the man I used to know. A sigh in his sleep, a shift toward me. But mostly he stayed still, his breathing, even as if his dreams belonged to someone else now. One Saturday morning, I caught my reflection in the hallway mirror. My expression was neutral, almost pleasant, but my eyes looked like they'd been somewhere I couldn't quite name. That's when I realized I wasn't waiting for him to tell me the truth. I was waiting to see what kind of person I'd become while he kept it from me. The next time he lied about where he'd been, about who had called, I didn't flinch. I just filed it away, another mark on a map I was drawing in my head. A map that, when finished, might lead me somewhere entirely outside of this house. And maybe that was the part he hadn't counted on, that silence could be a form of movement, and that I'd been walking farther from him with every quiet day that passed. It was late when I lit the candle. Not late in the sense of time, but in the sense of the air, when the house had gone still enough that every sound felt deliberate. Jack had gone to bed early, claiming exhaustion. I'd nodded, let him retreat to the dark. The candle was on the bathroom shelf, one I'd bought months ago during a sale, amber glass, and a label with cursive so faint it might as well have been a secret. He'd once loved the scent, warm, resinous, a trace of cedar and smoke. I struck the match and watched the flame take the wax, softening almost instantly. I didn't turn on the light. The mirror reflected only what the candle allowed, my face half in shadow, my eyes dark and my mouth unreadable. I could see the faint line at my jaw where tension had made its home. The flicker danced across the tiles, warping their straight edges into something fluid. I leaned against the counter and thought about the last time I'd seen Jack light a candle. It had been in December, the night of that heavy snow when we'd lost power for hours. We'd set them all over the house, pooling light into corners, making shadows seem softer. That night, the glow had felt like protection. This one felt like interrogation. The scent grew stronger, folding over me until it was almost too much. I wondered if it clung to his memory the way it did mine. If wherever he was when he wasn't here, he ever caught a trace of it and thought of me. I blew gently on the flame, watching it bow, recover, steady itself again. I thought about how easy it would be to snuff it out completely, how quickly a room could lose its light. Somewhere down the hall, a floorboard groaned. I froze listening, but the sound didn't come again. Maybe the house was settling. Maybe it was Jack awake and watching from the shadows. The candle burned lower wax, pooling at its base. I traced my finger along the edge of the sink, the cool porcelain grounding me. I realized not for the first time how much of myself I'd set aside over the years, small decisions, preferences, habits, filing them away to keep the peace. And I thought of how quietly those sacrifices stack, how they become the room you live in without realizing you built it yourself. The flame sputtered once before catching again. Its resilience was almost irritating. I blew it out this time, watched the thin column of smoke twist upward, fading into nothing. The smell of it lingered sharp and ghostly. I left the bathroom door open when I stepped out. The dark felt different without the candle's pulse. The hallway seemed longer, the doorway to the bedroom smaller. Jack was asleep or pretending to be. His back was to me, the steady rise and fall of his shoulders unbroken. I slid into bed without a sound. The scent of the candle still clung faintly to my skin, a reminder of something I couldn't yet name. In the dark, I thought maybe the trick isn't learning how to keep the flame alive. Maybe it's knowing when to let it go out. The call came just after 9. I was sitting at the kitchen table with a cooling cup of tea, letting the steam blur the edges of my thoughts. Lydia's name lit up the screen, and for a moment I considered letting it go to voicemail. She had a way of speaking into the spaces I'd carefully left empty. Her voice was urgent, no preamble. "I saw him," she said. My grip on the mug tightened. "Saw who, Jack?" "At the diner off Route 14. She paused. "He wasn't alone." I expected her to say the woman from the call, but she didn't. Younger Lydia added her tone, heavy, deliberate. Early 20s, maybe. Brown hair. Laughs like she's trying to prove something. The image came too easily, his hand on the table, leaning in his phone face down beside a sweating glass of water. I could picture the way he smiled at her, that half smile that once belonged to me in the quiet parts of the day. "Did he see you?" I asked. "No." I stayed outside. A beat of silence. "Elena, he's not just careless. He's building something separate." The phrase lodged in my chest. Building something separate. It sounded permanent, intentional. Not an accident, not a lapse. A life beyond mine, brick by brick. I didn't say much after that. Lydia filled the space with small updates, her neighbor's new dog, the weather, but the words slid past me without catching. After we hung up, I sat there staring at the tea, its surface gone still and cool. It was the first morning in weeks I'd finished a cup while it was still warm. The realization startled me. Somewhere between Lydia's words and my last sip, a thin clarity had settled over me like frost on glass. When Jack came home that night, I watched him move through the kitchen, noting every detail. The looseness in his shoulders, the faint smell of cologne. I didn't recognize the way he hummed under his breath like someone carrying a private song. He kissed my cheek, and I didn't pull away, but I didn't lean in either. Over dinner, he talked about a meeting that had run long. I let him tell it, each detail carefully stacked like a story rehearsed just enough to feel natural. I didn't question a single part. The absence of my questions seemed to make him more at ease, and that oddly made me feel more distant than any lie could. Later, when he'd gone to bed, I stood in the doorway to the kitchen and let the dark press in. Lydia's words replayed themselves quieter each time, but no less sharp. Building something separate. I looked at the table where we'd eaten together, the mugs on the counter, the faint outline of the candle's scent still clinging to the air from the night before. Everything was in its place, and yet none of it felt like mine. The key was in the laundry room under a chipped ceramic dish where we kept loose buttons and coins. I wasn't looking for it. I was reaching for a stray sock that had fallen behind the dryer, but when my fingers brushed metal, I knew what it was before I pulled it into view. I shouldn't have known it fit his office door, but I did. The office was the one place in the house I never entered. Not because I'd been told not to, but because the closed door spoke for itself. The way he locked it when he left for trips, the way he always pulled it shut tight, even if he was just stepping into the kitchen for a glass of water, it had the weight of a room meant to be left alone. I held the key in my palm, felt the teeth of it pressing against my skin, and went to the door before I could talk myself out of it. The lock turned with a soft click. The sound felt louder than it should have in the quiet hallway. Inside, the air was cooler, dustier, like the room had been holding its breath. The blinds were half closed, casting narrow bands of light across the desk. Everything was arranged neatly, too neatly. A stack of folders, perfectly aligned pens in a cup, a single mug, with a faint coffee ring at the bottom. On the desk sat a manila envelope with my name written on it. My first thought was that it was for me. A letter maybe, or some long-forgotten document I'd asked him to keep safe. I slid the papers out and felt the shift before I saw it. Legal forms, divorce papers. Unsigned but filled in. My name and his typed side by side at the top, separated by the thin black line of the word verses. I stood there for a long time reading the words without really absorbing them. They blurred at the edges as though the paper itself didn't want to be clear. He'd been planning this, quietly, carefully. Before I'd heard the call before the drawer, before Lydia's warning. I slid the papers back into the envelope, smoothing the edges, as if that could undo the fact that I'd seen them. I placed it exactly where it had been the angle just right. The blinds rattled faintly when I passed. I closed the door behind me and locked it again, the key warm now in my hand. In the laundry room, I returned it to the chipped dish, setting it down with the coins and buttons as though it had never left. I didn't cry. I didn't call Lydia. I didn't tell Jack. But something in my chest shifted open, not with grief, not even with anger, just space. The space you make when you realize you've been walking toward a door you'll eventually have to step through, and now you can see the outline of it ahead. I kept the receipt from the drawer folded in my wallet for 3 days before I called the number on it. 3 days of taking it out, tracing the ink where the name curved, wondering who had written it and why it had been in his nightstand. The paper had begun to soften at the edges from my handling, like it was absorbing the hesitation I'd been pouring into it. That night, Jack said he had a late meeting and left before dinner. I waited until the sound of his car faded down the street before I unfolded the receipt and dialed. The phone rang twice. Then a man answered. His voice was hesitant, a little rough around the edges, older than I expected. "Hello." I told him my name first and last, and then I said I think we've both been speaking to the same person. There was a pause long enough for me to hear his breathing change. "Jack," he said finally, and it wasn't a question. "Yes." He didn't ask how I'd gotten his number, and I didn't offer. We spoke carefully at first, two strangers feeling the edges of a wound we hadn't chosen. He told me he'd known Jack for years. Not well enough, apparently, he added, and the words carried a tired humor that didn't quite land. I told him about the voice on the call, about the drawer, about the hotel keycard. He told me about dinners canceled at the last minute, about messages that arrived late, and were always short, about noticing when someone's attention starts to belong somewhere else. We didn't try to fill in every gap. Some things were better left unspoken, their outlines clear enough without the details. But by the end of the hour, the picture had sharpened in my mind. Jack wasn't just wandering. He was weaving something threads in different colors patterns that overlapped without meeting. At one point, the man asked, "So what are you going to do?" I almost laughed. "I don't know yet." When we hung up, I sat in the kitchen with the lights off, the receipt still on the table, the phone cooling in my hand. Outside, the street was quiet, windows glowing in houses that looked steadier than mine felt. I didn't feel shaky anymore. I didn't even feel particularly angry. There was only a kind of steadiness, like when you realize a storm has already passed and what's left is the cleanup. By the time Jack came home, I'd put the receipt back in my wallet. He kissed me on the top of the head, asked if I'd eaten. I said yes, though. The plate on the counter told the truth for me. I watched him pour himself a glass of water. The way his hand lingered on the faucet as though turning it off required more thought than it should. In that moment, I knew the call I'd made had shifted something not between us, not yet, but in me. The ground under my feet felt different now, solid, in a way it hadn't for months. And once you feel that, you can't unfeel it. He was already at the table when I came into the kitchen, his phone propped against the sugar jar, thumb scrolling. The smell of toast hung in the air, warm but somehow stale. He had his tie on, but his jacket was draped over the chair, as if he hadn't decided yet whether he was staying or going. I poured my coffee before sitting. The mug felt heavier than usual. I watched him butter his toast, the knife scraping against the plate. His eyes flicked to the phone between motions, like he was afraid it might vanish if left alone too long. I didn't speak right away. I took a slow sip, felt the heat against my tongue, let it linger. Then I asked, "Where's the hotel key card?" From his hand froze midair, knife suspended above the bread. A second passed. 2. He didn't look at me. What hotel key? I set my coffee down carefully, the ceramic tapping against wood. The one in your nightstand. His shoulders lifted a fraction, the breath he took longer than usual. "You've been going through my things?" I didn't answer. The question wasn't the point. For a moment, the only sound was the faint hum of the refrigerator. His toast sat untouched. My coffee cooled in its cup. The silence stretched thick and deliberate. He put the knife down and leaned back, his eyes finally meeting mine. They were flat unreadable. "You've got the wrong idea." I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because the phrase was so practiced it felt like he'd been saving it. "Do I asked. He didn't reply. I took another sip of coffee, now lukewarm, and felt the quiet between us grow a second spine. It wasn't fragile anymore. It was sturdy, something we could both lean on without fear of it breaking. I stood, picked up my mug, and carried it to the sink. Behind me, he stayed seated, unmoving, like he was waiting for a cue that wasn't coming. As I rinsed the mug, I realized I didn't want an answer to my question, not because I feared it, but because I already knew it. The details didn't matter anymore. The shape of the truth was enough. When I turned back, he was still there, the toast on his plate untouched, the phone beside him like a companion. "I'll see you tonight," he said finally, as if that closed the conversation. I didn't answer. I just walked out of the kitchen, feeling the floorboards under my feet, as though they were marking my steps. In the hallway, I paused, listening to the faint clink of his mug as he picked it up. The sound was smaller than I expected, almost gentle. I kept walking. I packed in the quiet. Not the frantic kind of packing you do before a trip, but the deliberate sort, each item chosen with care. A small bag, nothing more. I didn't take clothes I couldn't carry in one hand. I didn't take things that could be replaced. Only what mattered. The candle from the bathroom shelf, the spare key from the chipped dish in the laundry room, the folded receipt edges softened from handling. Jack was in the hallway when I came out of the bedroom. He leaned against the wall, arms crossed, as if he'd been waiting there long enough to get comfortable. His eyes dropped to the bag, then back to my face. "Going somewhere?" he asked. His voice was steady, but there was a tightness in it like a rope pulled just short of snapping. "Yes." "Want to talk about it?" "No." We stood there for a moment, the distance between us crowded with everything we hadn't said. The air in the hallway felt heavier, pressing in on either side. I walked toward the front door. He didn't move to stop me. He didn't follow. He just watched the silence between us, making the space feel longer than it was. When I opened the door, the cool night air wrapped around me. It smelled faintly of rain, though the sky was clear. I stepped over the threshold, my bag strap digging into my shoulder. The door closed behind me with a sound softer than I expected. Not a slam, not a click, just a settling, like it knew there was no reason to hold tight anymore. The street was empty. Porch lights glowed in windows that weren't mine. I started walking the pavement, cool through the thin soles of my shoes. I didn't look back, not because I didn't want to see, but because I already knew what was there: a man in a hallway, a closed door, and a house that had stopped being home long before I left. The bag was lighter than I thought it would be.